Good evening. I'm attorney Lawrence Berliner. I'm an attorney in the field of special education law. With me tonight is our co-host, Jane Faherty, who's the director of the JumpStart program at the Jewish Community Center. She's also a special education advocate. And we are welcoming, for those who are first-time viewers, we welcome you. And for those who are coming back year after year, Jane, this is what, our third year of doing this?
It's our third year, actually more than 3 years, Lawrence. I think it's getting on for 3.5.
Okay, 3.5 years. We appreciate your continued viewership, your questions, and participation. We're continuing our Zoom webinars. We try to do it about every month, and we'll announce the next one at the end of tonight's webinar, because we're part of a community of concerned parents, professionals, and we are still learning how to connect with one another in these still unprecedented times. Although some of the COVID-19 pandemic is behind us, we're still facing new challenges, and some of those challenges will be discussed tonight. Jane and I have been moderating a series of webinars to address issues that are coming up and the impact of these issues on your child's special education journey. And we're here to empower those for the road ahead. Tonight we will be discussing, there's a lot of contemporary information. It's on the news, it's in the newspaper, wherever your source of information is. The needs of special education students in the area of mental health and the impact on students. We're still adjusting to a brand new school year. We've dealing with a lot of issues affecting our children's return to school. I do have a disclaimer. The webinar is being recorded. A copy of the webinar will be provided to each person who is registered. The information provided during the webinar does not constitute specific legal advice regarding you or your child's circumstances and should not be relied upon as such. The webinar does not establish an attorney-client relationship with myself, attorney Lawrence Berliner, or a professional relationship with Jane Faherty or Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler, our guest tonight, or the Stamford JCC. By signing up, you agree to receive future information about webinars and events from the Stamford Jewish Community Center, the Law Office of Lawrence Berliner, LLC. We are using Zoom, which is a third-party format, and it's not an agent of the Law Office of Lawrence Berliner or the Stamford Jewish Community Center or Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler. The information we are providing tonight is based primarily on Connecticut law. We know we have people from other states and in many cases from other countries, and we appreciate your participation. But most of what we're saying is based upon Connecticut law or federal law. If you're from another state or country, you should consult your own laws and policies in that jurisdiction. So I think our last webinar was in May. How you been, Jane?
It's been good. It's been a busy start to the school year. Lots of issues are popping up for both families and their students. So it's great to have Roni here today, because one of the most prevalent issues is mental health for children of all ages, and also their parents too. And it's great to have Roni Cohen-Sandler here tonight to help us navigate these very difficult times, which don't seem to be getting any easier in terms of this domain of supporting our children with their mental health within a school setting, and also within the home setting too. So it's great to have her here tonight for this conversation that is so important and so prevalent. And hopefully by the end of tonight, we can have some strategies that we can go back to our teams and districts with to really help make a difference for these young people as they navigate the path forward this year. But it's good to be back, Larry, after a brief summer off.
All too brief. We have received many questions prior to tonight's webinar. We'll try to get to the questions that are germane and on point to tonight's topic. If you do have a question, we would ask that you put it in the Q&A section at the bottom of the computer screen, not in the chat. The reason is this is being recorded. The Q&A is not recorded, whereas the chat is recorded. So in an effort to maintain privacy or confidentiality, we ask that you put your questions in the Q&A section. Before we begin, since Jane and I were here last, there have been some changes since we were here with our General Assembly and federal grants. But the month of September, besides having Hurricane Lee, has been a very exciting month. The White House is announcing the 50th anniversary of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. They're having a conference later this month on the 50th anniversary. This is the bedrock civil rights law for people with disabilities. This is the bedrock that the federal special education law was built upon, the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's hard to believe that this law has been on the books for 50 years, and my clients, adults with disabilities, children with disabilities, are all benefiting. Another exciting change in the law was our General Assembly extended the age of eligibility for special education through the end of the school year that a student turns age 22. It used to be through your 22nd birthday. Now that is through the end of the school year that a student turns age 22. The State Department of Education has a policy guidance, July 14th, 2023. The state website is ct.gov. ct.gov will take you to the department and agencies, and you want to click on the Department of Education and look at the publications in special education. Other changes in the law, we are establishing a task force that looks at the statutory definition of intellectual disability for those who are served by the State Department of Developmental Services. Our state definition needs to be examined closely, and there's a task force. Also, there's a transition life skills program that's being established to help those individuals transition from high school to post-secondary opportunities if they are clients of the Department of Developmental Services. The last two pieces of information, the governor's office has announced $15 million in school mental health specialist grants. 72 school districts in Connecticut will be receiving at least $50,000, $60,000 as a minimum with these mental health grants, which sort of dovetails with tonight's topic. And the State Department of Education also announced last month almost $6 million to improve special education outcomes. I would like to see both of those grant programs implemented to their fullest. So without further ado, we have Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler, who is a licensed clinical psychologist. And she's an author, a speaker with decades of experience. I've known her on a personal basis, but maybe some of you have seen her on various television shows, CBS, Good Morning America, PBS, and others. She has many books in print. If you go on her website, you'll find a lot of resources and links to her books and other publications. And we're very honored to have Dr. Cohen-Sandler back again to discuss issues affecting students' mental health in a school setting. Without further ado, we would like to turn this over to Dr. Roni, as many of my clients call her.
Thank you very much for having me back. I'm really delighted and honored to be back. And I understand that there's a record turnout tonight, and I'm not surprised because this topic is so, so important. It's hard for me to imagine talking to parents today where this topic doesn't come up. And recently I read that Pew Research Center, which I love the research that they come out with, and they were surveying parents about what they were most concerned about for their children. And not surprisingly, the number one thing that parents are concerned about these days is their kids' mental health, anxiety, depression, suicide, absolutely number one. And they asked parents, like, are you very concerned about it or somewhat concerned about it? 75% of parents were very concerned about mental health. So if you were one of those parents, you know you are in good company. And it really makes sense because prior to the pandemic, we already were seeing rates of mental health illness going up, even in very small children. And that was for lots of reasons. Part of it was that this generation of young people, and really it's kind of a blessing and a curse, they're much more concerned about issues beyond themselves. They're much more concerned about culture. You see some of the leaders of this generation and how they're speaking out and advocating about things. So, for example, I've had 10 and 12-year-olds in my practice who are talking about climate change and political issues. I've never had that before. This is all kind of new. They're concerned about gun violence. They're concerned about school shootings and racial issues and the political environment. So all of that was going on. And then there's this pandemic. And the pandemic, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that whatever challenges kids had before, they were exacerbated by the pandemic. The one exception that I would say is that early on in the pandemic, when I was seeing kids who had social anxiety, they were so happy because they didn't have to go to school. They didn't have to be in the classroom. They could be online. And maybe it was like 10% of the student body, but they were delighted. However, that has changed since they've had to go back to school. But it's really important to understand, I think, what happened during the pandemic, because not only were kids anxious, but their parents were anxious too. People were getting sick. People were in some cases dying. There were financial issues going on. Suddenly, for the first time, not only didn't their parents have the answers, doctors didn't have the answers. Their schooling was interrupted. And this was really important because for so many kids, that structure of the day was very, very supportive emotionally. And also seeing their friends was supportive emotionally. A lot of kids, you ask them, why do you like going to school? And they say, to see my friends. You know, you suggest doing something different. No, I want to go to school. Why do you want to go to school? To see my friends. And, you know, they weren't able to see their grandparents who were sources of support, emotional support. And then they had these gaps in their learning. No matter how much, you know, school tried, they couldn't recreate a regular classroom over Zoom. It wasn't possible. So there were gaps in kids' learning. And also what I'm seeing now when I'm evaluating kids is not just in the gaps of things that they know, but gaps in learning how to learn. So one thing is kids were on their devices all the time. And I am not saying that in a negative way in this context, because it was a lifesaver for them. In so many ways, they used their devices as a way of connecting with people, which was paramount to their mental health, for entertainment, to learn things of their own. It was fantastic. But the problem is their brains got used to devices. And so now they're having more difficulty concentrating for longer periods of time. And also when they were learning from home, they didn't have all of these executive function tasks that they would normally have. So even remembering to bring their homework or put it in their backpack, or remember their lunch or remember their lunch money, all those kinds of things. So I'm seeing the effects of that now. And the most important thing I want to say is that kids missed out on, you know, a year and a half or 2 years of development. Their development kind of stagnated. And so when I see kids now, when I do, let's say, a program in school, like a wellness day, or I'm speaking to kids, I actually, even when I'm doing evaluation, I have to check my notes because I keep thinking that the kids that I'm seeing are 2 years younger than they really are. They really just are immature for their age because they've just missed out on these experiences. So I think that almost more than anything is what is happening now when they get back to school. They haven't had the transitions, let's say, from elementary school to middle school. Maybe they went through the pandemic during those years and suddenly, kaplunk, they're in 6th or 7th grade and they don't have the emotional resources. They don't have the emotional self-regulation. They don't have the social skills. And that's true in the high school, and it's true in college also. It's really true, the whole spectrum. So we're really asking a lot of them. And I think that in many cases, they're not well prepared. And it's causing parents a lot of angst. It really is. So I'm just glad you're all here tonight. And I hope we can give you some valuable information that you can take home with you.
Well, one of the angst it's causing is school refusal. And that's something that's been prevalent in the questions we received before tonight. So, Lawrence, there's 2 issues to this. Obviously, Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler can talk about the emotional side and how parents can navigate that and work with a child in a school on strategies to support that. But in a practical sense as well, Larry, in terms of legally and the rights of the parents and how to help a parent navigate that with the district, what strategies and steps should a parent take when their child is refusing to go to school?
Well, there are in-school answers and out-of-school answers, and the out-of-school answers speak to the pediatrician, speak to a psychologist, a clinical social worker. Don't ignore the problem, because the problem will not go away and it will back up on a parent and student's doorstep with a claim of truancy. I think it's after 4 days in a month or 9 days or 10 days in a school year that you exceed a certain number of days, there's truancy. Referrals to juvenile court can result. Referrals to resource officers inside the building. So there can be some legal pressure and some legal consequences. Ignoring the problem doesn't make it go away. For students without an IEP, we have a state law. The federal law is called child fine. School districts are obligated to reach out and offer services to students with actual or suspected disabilities. We have a state law that expands upon that. When a school has knowledge that a child's attendance, behavior, or school performance is at a marginal or unacceptable level of performance, the school district shall, not may, shall make a prompt referral to a PPT meeting, or at least offer that PPT meeting to parents. And that's the formal meeting to discuss, is this a school problem, a home problem, a combination of both? Could the student benefit from evaluations, public school, private evaluations? Can the student benefit from a 504 plan, or do they need more intensive services with an IEP, an individual education plan? And that's how the world is supposed to work. The problem with a capital P, some students are not on anybody's radar screen. They're not a disciplinary problem. They're essentially invisible. And those are the ones you really have to worry about, because they're not on anybody's radar screen. And then suddenly a dam will burst open and there'll be a bigger set of problems down the road. So the earlier a school, and earlier a family can intervene and try to figure out what's going on, the better the outcome.
That's great. And then, Roni, when you do discover and you realize that this is a trend, this isn't a one-off, that my child is not, ready on a Monday, but it starts to become a habit, what should parents do, and how do you identify and tease out that it now is becoming problematic versus just it's an off day, or they're having maybe some social anxiety with the friend group, but it doesn't extend beyond that? How do you tease those things out, and what do you do as a parent?
Sure. Well, I will get to all of those questions, Jane. I just want to say one thing about school refusal or chronic absenteeism, whatever you want to call it. So many parents are dealing with this right now because the statistic is that it has doubled since the pandemic. And now 33% of students in this country are dealing with it. And that means 33% of parents are dealing with it. And I think it's one of the hardest things that you can go through as a family. It causes a huge amount of stress. So in order to differentiate, I think always you are attuned to your child, your student, and you kind of know when something is going on. That's your first source of information, really, is to talk to your child. And some parents are afraid to ask questions for fear of sort of stirring up the nest or anything. And I think it's always good to be age appropriately inquisitive with your child and say, how are things going in school? What's the best part of your day? What's the hardest part of your day? If you could change one thing, what would it be? If the child doesn't know how to express to you what's going on, those kind of questions can be very, very helpful if they're older, and then they can talk about what's going on. If they're having problems with students, you want to address if it's on a regular basis, if it's something that would rise to the level of bullying, or if it's just normal social, kids trying to navigate being kids. And sometimes they're on the outs with each other and all of that. And that's something you can coach your child with. I think the other thing is that you want to get information from the school too, because sometimes our kids, they hold it together during the school day, and then they come home and they just fall apart and they give us the worst version of things. And so sometimes it's helpful to ask the teacher, for example, how did my child do at school yesterday? I think might have been a hard day. And the teacher says, oh, it's funny that you say that, because, I saw Molly, talking delightedly to her group of friends, and, I'm not sure, what you're talking about. So to get that kind of perspective is really helpful sometimes. But here's the thing, there's this Sundayitis kind of thing, which is a real thing, where people on Sundays sort of get anxious about their week. It happens to adults too. And if you're seeing that kind of thing, it could be a transition problem. Many students, whether they're identified as having an IEP or not, have difficulties with transition. And the transition from weekend to weekday is a real thing to a school day. And so if you're seeing that kind of thing, that may be where you want to have your focus. And it's really good to empower kids to take part in those transitions and make as many decisions as they can. And you can ask them, well, what would work better for you? Like maybe our routine in the morning needs to be switched up a little bit. What would work for you? Would it work better for you to get things out at night, or that kind of thing? So there's some of the things that you can do to kind of test out whether this is rising to a level of a chronic problem. If you're seeing, like this is the beginning of the school year, let's say almost the end of September, if you're seeing 2, 3, 4 absences already this year, that should be a major red flag to you, because the research shows that kids who miss 4 days of school in the beginning of the year are more likely to miss a month by the end of the year. It's a slippery slope. The reason is it's avoidance. Whatever is bothering them or worrying them about being in school, if they get to avoid it, it's very reinforcing. It's such a relief to them that it's very reinforcing. So the goal is to get them in school where they can develop coping strategies to deal with whatever's going on. So here's what I would say that you should do, which is exactly what Larry just said, is you want to get the school involved. If ever there is a situation with your child where you want to work very, very closely with your student's school, it is this. And oftentimes there's a protocol in place. Schools really want your students to be in school, and they will do things to help you. That's my experience. In fact, I will tell you that 2 things, the bad news and the good news. The bad news is that in the last couple of years, I've seen more cases of school refusal than probably in the previous 2 decades. The good news is a lot of schools are recognizing that, and they're really trying to help parents. And I've had a lot of referrals in the last couple of years that were initiated by the schools, that the school paid for and considered an independent educational evaluation, because they wanted to see what was going on. They wanted to rule out an educational problem that might have been underlying what was going on, tease out the emotional part, and really get information that could help them help the student. So I've seen, for example, things like social workers or guidance counselors or psychologists or teachers like special ed teachers being involved in the team. And then parents bring the student to school in the morning and the team goes out to the car and they will greet the child there. And that helps avoid this tearful separation from mom or dad. Or students who can walk into the school, but not necessarily their homeroom or their classroom. They're assigned a point person that they can see first thing in the morning upon going to school to make sure they're kind of ready for the day. And the opposite can happen at the end of the day where they go and speak to their point person and sort of go over the day. How do things go? What do you need for tomorrow? That kind of thing. Other times there are quiet areas that students can go to during the day if they are emotionally overwhelmed, or designated people that they can kind of drop into see. So those are some of the things that schools do. What I want to say here is kind of like a cautionary note, in that I have found that no other situation can elicit sort of tension and conflict and kind of animosity between families and schools. There's a lot of blaming that sometimes goes on that's really a shame, because the student doesn't benefit. And you're human. You're all parents. You're humans, and you might be annoyed by something the teacher's doing or not doing, or you may feel the school's not doing enough. But if you convey that to your student, that is a big mistake, because they pick up on that and they use it to their advantage. And so I definitely would say that's something you want to avoid. You can have those feelings and deal with them, yourself or with the school. But, if your child complains about the teacher, you can listen, you can be very empathic, and then you can talk about, okay, well, how do you think you should handle this? Can you talk to your teacher about this? Can you ask your teacher this? You can coach your child. You can do role play, but you can't say, you're right, your teacher's terrible, I've got to switch you, that kind of thing. I'm exaggerating, but so those are some of my thoughts about this. I feel like we could talk about this for a week because it's a complex and very important topic, but I think we'll maybe stop here.
I just wanted to add two additional points. What I'm seeing is schools willing to go into the family home to meet with the student on their home turf to try to coax them into school, or making phone calls. And I've never seen that before. So schools are starting to use what I'll call the out-of-box thinking, anything that will help the family, help the student get to school. That's all I wanted to add. Very good points.
So I guess the underlying thing for some parents, and we had this as a question that came in earlier, is that how, and this is to both of you, if your child has been identified as having underlying mental health issues, anxiety, depression, or other disorders that they're working through, how can that be integrated into an IEP to meaningfully help the child connect and engage with their academic curriculum? And what steps should you take? And also, are there resources that parents should be asking for and related services that should be applied to an IEP to help support some of these mental health conditions that a student might be facing or tackling?
Well, from a legal perspective, I'm often dealing with a chicken and the egg type of question. Do we have to work on the academics to get the social and emotional to settle down? Do we have to work on the social and emotional to get the academics to kick in? And there's not a one-size-fits-all answer to that. So from a legal perspective, we're looking at the adverse impact on a student's education. What is the underlying cause? And that's where a comprehensive evaluation, sometimes a neuropsychological evaluation, sometimes other kinds of psychiatric on rare occasions, in my experience, will help get a better finger on the pulse of what's getting in the way of the student's ability to succeed and take advantage of natural talents. And once we have a better idea of what the barriers are, then we program, that's the IEP, around that with goals and objectives. And in addition to what are called related services, and that related service can be counseling services, it can be school mental health services, as they're now being called today, school psychologists, school counselors, school social workers. On occasion, schools will contract out those services to private professionals in the community if the student is presenting issues above and beyond the skills, expertise, sometimes the time the school staff has. Another related service that's often overlooked is parent training. People think of related services as counseling, occupational therapy, speech and language, physical therapy, but one of the many related services is parent training. So parents are trained by the school to better understand how they can participate in the education of their child, because whatever happens at home affects school, and whatever happens at school affects home. So it'd be very nice if both the school staff and the family were working together in the best interest of the child, the student. And that sometimes happens. In my experience, all too often it doesn't happen, and that's when we're going into crisis mode. So the more we can intervene early, the better. Keep small problems small and manageable before they snowball and become unmanageable.
So when I'm listening to you talk about this subject, Larry, what comes to mind for me, and this was one of the questions, in fact, that someone wanted to address, is what happens when a child has mental health problems that affect them socially? You know, how does that figure in everything? And it's a great question, because a lot of times I find that it's not sort of immediately apparent, even to parents, that kids who are having trouble making friends, or knowing how to join a group, or regulating their emotions within a social situation, that necessarily is an academic problem or could be affecting kids in school. And I find that that's actually one of the more common effects that it has. And what I hear about so often are kids who are very self-conscious and feel uncomfortable walking into a classroom unless they have a friend or at least an ally in that classroom. You know, otherwise they don't know who to talk to, they don't know who to look at, they just feel so self-conscious. And it affects, for example, if they're sitting in the class, it affects whether they feel comfortable raising their hand to ask a question. This is important for kids who also have learning issues and who may need to check in with the teacher to make sure that they're understanding things. It can affect whether they're going to answer a question when the teacher calls on them. Sometimes in the higher grades, that can affect the teacher's perception of them as either a student who's engaged, pardon me, or not engaged in the class, interested, or maybe not participating and affecting a participation grade. And it even affects whether if kids are absent for a day, whether they have someone in the class that they can call and ask what was the homework. And it really affects students' ability to work with other students when they're put into groups, which is happening, you know, a lot more these days, group learning situations. And so what I've seen is that this is all included in the IEP, and these kinds of skills become goals that are written into it. And it's very important to see the interaction between these things, because it's almost impossible, as you say, Larry, to, I mean, this is what I do when I do evaluations, and it's never like one or the other. It's always that there's this kind of synergistic effect. But you're right, I try to find out, well, which is really contributing the most to this situation, so that we can address it with the most. But invariably, it's a little bit of everything. You know, kids are not simple, they're always complex. And it's like teasing out which are the effects of is making the most difference. So that's why an evaluation comes through. Yes, Jane.
So if we've completed an evaluation, we've established that there is an underlying mental health condition that needs to be addressed and supported. And there are so many, I'm sure, to label and to name and to diagnose. But what, in your experience more recently, have been the 3 top solutions that have been the most impactful for students to help support this mental health crisis that so many students and their families are encountering at this time?
Well, I thought that that was a great question. And when I thought about it, I had to cheat a little bit because it was a 4th, but I'll try to be succinct as if I can. So one thing that I think is the most important thing, it doesn't matter what's going on with your child in school. It's really about your relationship with your student. It is the most important parenting tool in your repertoire. And so the way I think to have a really strong, trusting relationship with your student in which your student can talk to you about things is to really listen to them, really hear them out and make them feel heard. That is most protective of problems. And if you're already having problems, that becomes the basis of communication, which is really key to any other step that you're going to take. And the second related thing is developing what I would consider to be like an age-appropriate collaborative relationship with your student so that they know that you're supporting them, you're on their side, that you'll advocate for them with the school, but you'll also provide guide rails if they need it. So that is the foundation for everything. The third thing I would say is, and this is a hard one because we all love our kids and we want to protect them, we want life to be easier for them. But I always advise parents only to give them as much help as they really need. Don't provide so much scaffolding that they don't develop these very crucial skills that they need on their own. And by that, I mean executive function skills. That the kids missed out on honing during the pandemic. I'm seeing this so vividly when I evaluate kids. They can't do anything for themselves. They can't plan or organize or manage their work, their feelings, or their behavior. They're lacking personal agency and self-regulation. And it's autonomy and independence that really make kids feel good about themselves. So along with the actual skills that they're learning in school, this confidence helps them with stick-to-itiveness, which is the foundation for success. And the fourth one that I have to stick in here is that, and we haven't mentioned this yet, but I think it's so important to prioritize students maintaining a kind of well-balanced life. And I say this because so many of the kids who are identified in IEPs, they have so much support and so much remediation, and they may need a lot of that. But it's also important not to overwhelm them and to make sure that they have a balance of rest and sleep and socializing and recreation and downtime. So many students tell me that they come home in the afternoon and they're exhausted after their day and they just want to lay up on their beds and stare at the ceiling. And their parents come in and say, "What are you doing? You have all this homework. You should be doing your homework. Why aren't you being productive?" That's the word. And I have to respectfully disagree with that perspective because I actively encourage kids to do just that when they get home from school. What they're accomplishing when they seem to be staring at the ceiling is actually invaluable. They're decompressing, they're quieting down their minds and bodies, they're releasing all those toxic stress hormones, they're processing their experience and their feelings, and they're really they're learning more about themselves. They're developing insight, and maybe they're even coming up with strategies and solutions to their challenges. So I would say if you make sure that your kids have this balanced life, they're going to be that much more available for whatever school interventions they need and get.
So I have a question, Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler. I agree with you that everybody needs time at the end of a busy day to have a moment to decompress and process what we've experienced. Now, for some parents, the challenge is the child will not decompress quietly while taking a moment on their bed. They will do it while being in front of a computer screen, playing Fortnite or something like that, which they will then become absorbed in for an extortionate amount of time, which will then prevent them from doing maybe homework or practicing executive functioning skills or practicing something that might be more physically beneficial to them. And then that then creates a dynamic in their household, which is challenging, but then has then overlays in the education system, because the student then goes to school the next day without the work that's been completed. And we have this unfortunate cycle that begins. So what advice do you have for parents when you feel that a child should come home and just relax, but the child's interpretation of that is that's my ticket to go and be on Fortnite or whatever it might be in front of a screen, which, as we know, isn't really the way that your brain really relaxes in those moments? Any advice for students and parents on that, but also for districts to support parents navigating this really difficult balance that they now have?
I'm laughing, Jane, because we literally could spend a week talking about that problem. I mean, I literally wrote a book about that subject. so I would say,
in a nutshell,
I do a lot of, I know, I do a lot of consulting with parents, parenting guidance about this very topic. So what I would say is the definition, we have to differentiate relaxing and relaxing your brain and decompressing with entertainment. Okay. And so there's a place for everything. I think that obviously we do not want our students having a steady diet of Fortnite. It has its place, but I think it's more of a reward rather than, 15 minutes of Fortnite the next day, as opposed to when you first get home. So the student, this is a good time to enlist your students' help. Instead of being the bad parent, mean parent, and saying, you will not do this, that look, we have to figure out some ways for you to relax when you get home and just bring down the temperature of your brain and relax your body and your brain and eat healthy and all this stuff. So what kinds of activities do you think that you can do besides Fortnite or whatever, which is more of an entertainment kind of thing? And if you do some brainstorming with your student and they're the ones who come up with these kinds of things, that's what I'm talking about, the collaboration, they're more likely to do it. And then you say, look, your responsibility is doing your homework. So if you do your homework, you're going to earn privileges, and you can earn privileges to play Fortnite or watch 15 minutes or whatever the next day, whatever. That's basically in a nutshell, I think. I want to go on, but I can't.
I know. Thank you.
No, I was smiling because this earlier, it was the end of last week, I was at a PPT meeting, and one of the recommendations from the psychologist was homework is not for adults to do or to complete. And so let them relax, find a way to motivate them, let them do the homework, and it shouldn't be a battleground for parents to get their child or student to do homework. They should want to do it because they've earned the privilege, or they've, so I just was smiling because I just had that as a professional recommendation from a report at the end of last week. We had a question come in tonight. The parent is talking about a 16-year-old who hasn't been in school for 3 years. You need to figure out a way to connect with that school district, contact the superintendent, the principal, if it's special education issues, the director of special education. If you're in Connecticut, request a PPT meeting. Remember, I mentioned the prompt referral to a PPT meeting. If a student's attendance, school performance is at an unacceptable or marginal level, and not being in school for 3 years is certainly the attendance and school performance is being unacceptable. You have to start somewhere. The school obviously is not reaching out to you, so you need to reach out to the school district. And
I want to say, oh, sorry, I want to interrupt you. Go ahead.
I also had one, and maybe Dr. Roni wants it. We have a question about migraine and disability and absenteeism. Is there some my perspective, that sounds like a somatic complaint unless there's some medical issue, but that's part and parcel of school refusal or school avoidance. We have a headache, a stomach ache, part of my body hurts. So.
Yeah, I can address that too. I just wanted to say that it may sound like a lot, 3 years, because it is a lot, but among the school refusal evaluations that I've gotten from school in the last couple of years, one was for a child who was out of school for 6 years, and another one out of school for 7 years. Mm-hmm. So yeah, this happens. And by the way, both of those situations had a really great resolution. I did an evaluation. It took a really long time, but it was done, and the school did what they had to do, and the kids are now in school and doing great. So I just want to say that that's on a happy note. So migraines are a tricky thing because they do have a physiological basis. They run in families. And sometimes even when kids complain of stomach aches, there are such things called abdominal migraines. And so it could be that. But a neurologist is able to diagnose this kind of thing. And there are generally treatments for it. And so, of course, there are psychological issues. I'm not saying that it's a psychosomatic thing, but children who are sick so much that they can't go to school, there are psychological issues that they have because they're ill and because they can't do things like go to school, or maybe they're missing out on other things as well. So this is where it's really important to get the team together, including the pediatrician or the neurologist, to talk about the treatments for this and how that can be incorporated into the school day, and how the student can learn coping strategies and techniques to get through, push through things like headaches, and when is it appropriate for them to go to the school nurse. One thing that I think is a general rule, maybe for parents, because I've seen this a lot, when you come up with a plan with the school and everybody is sort of on the same page and you're all working toward the same goal, sometimes, and this is the problem with cell phones, when kids have cell phones, they circumvent the channels that they're set up. And so they avoid the school psychologist or whomever, and they go straight to the nurse, and or they go to the bathroom and they call their parents from the bathroom, and their parents come pick them up. So I would not recommend that, because then you are really undermining this process of wanting the student to really face whatever is going on and to learn coping strategies. And it's not that it happens all the time, but you will get calls testing you if this is happening to you. Kids will test whether you will come rescue them, and you'll be tempted to. But it's more important that they get the message. I know this is hard for you, but I know that you have the strength to do this. These are the tools at your disposal. I can spend a couple of minutes on the phone with you now before I have to go, and I can breathe with you. And then you can talk to your school psychologist or someone, whoever the designated person is, and that person will help you.
This links to a question that we received before tonight that said how to know when to push and when to let go.
Yes, that is actually a great question. I took that question more to be academic when I was thinking about answering that question, because a lot of parents, wonder if their student really, isn't doing the level of work that they would like, isn't as motivated as they would like, like you can push yourself more to do this. You can, that kind of thing. I was taking it more, and we didn't just address that. So I think maybe I want to talk about it in that context, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I love this question, although I'm going to say it's probably the hardest one for me to answer. This is one of those situations where it's really important to understand where your student is coming from, like where the resistance is coming from. Maybe there's something that is going on that you don't know about, or your student doesn't realize or can't articulate. And so this is where you want to use all your sources of intel for your student, school, and whatever. But if you're more invested than your student, in, let's say, excelling in a certain subject or taking a higher level math than your student wants to take, or not taking a certain class altogether, then it becomes you kind of trying to motivate your student. And the best kind of motivation comes from intrinsically, internally. And so I think it's always better to find out from kids what they're really enjoying and what they're really passionate about, and to try to encourage that, because you're really going to get more bang for your buck. I mean, if it's something that is important, you have to decide, is this the hill that I want to die on? Because you're risking, if you push your kid more than they want to go, you're risking damaging your relationship with them. And to me, that already by what I've said, it's sacred. So what I would say is, if it's not that important, back off, at least for now. You can revisit it at some later date. But it doesn't apply to things like going to school. That is not, your job as a parent is to support your child in doing their job, which is to go to school and get an education. So that's where you can save the goodwill, in your relationship, and not press something that's not important. Save it for the things that really matter, choosing your battles.
And that's an excellent point, because often parents are called to take on responsibilities that they're ill-equipped for. For example, I often see incomplete schoolwork coming home as, quote, homework. Well, unless you have the curriculum, unless you know how to teach the assignment, it puts an unfair burden on the parents to pick up the slack because the student wasn't performing in school. Homework is homework, schoolwork is schoolwork, and they shouldn't be, mixed together, coming home as homework. We had a question that came in tonight about homeschooling. In Connecticut, this varies from state to state. We have homeschooling where parents are the teachers and the educators, and they educate their child at home. The school district has no responsibility to assist that child if they're homeschooled. We do have something called homebound instruction. And what homebound instruction is when there's a verified medical reason, which could include a psychological reason, that the student is unable to attend school for at least 10 days, and a physician, I think psychologists should be able to fill out the forms, but it just has physicians. So often it's a psychiatrist or a pediatrician who fills out a form, has a conversation with a school health official, typically a school nurse, to try to get homebound instruction in place, often an hour to 2 hours per day, based upon an agreed upon plan of instruction and location. If your child is homeschooled, or if your child is on homebound instruction, then child welfare, DCF, should not be involved, because there's no truancy that you're either outside the school system altogether, or you're connected to school through the tutoring program. It's when the child is not in school, not on homebound, not withdrawn from the district and being homeschooled, that's where Child Protective Services can get involved, DCF, juvenile court, if at least 10, 14 days or more of unexcused absences are occurring. So it's very important to know the terminology, or we're talking about homebound instruction, which is tutoring, homeschooling, which the parents are the teachers, the Board of Education, and trying to make sure that you're not running afoul of the law, which could create problems for both the parents with truancy and the students themselves. So I hope that answers that person's question. And one of the topics for tonight is, what do you do when you know your child is struggling with mental health issues and the school is just not responding? What are parents supposed to do? I have an answer. Maybe Jane and Dr. Roni have answers too.
Well, I think that this goes back to what we always talk about, Lawrence, is data and collecting information and being observant and making notes about your child's trends and their behaviors and how they're exhibiting them at home. Whether it is that they're refusing to do certain homework from particular classes, whether it is that they're trying to play truancy on certain days of the week, if there's trends in their behavior that you're starting to notice patterns with, collect that data and share that information with your team, with the district as soon as possible. Don't sit and worry. You must communicate and talk, because without that, you're unable to problem solve together. And remember, a PPT or part of a team, you're the most important person in that team because you know your child best. So I think it goes back to using your instinct and your intuition. Let that guide you, but substantiate it with anecdotal information if it must be, just notes, conversations, text messages you might receive from your child, phone calls you've overheard, changes in their diet, their sleep patterns, changes in their behaviors. Discern what might be a mood swing versus an adolescence thing you might typically expect, and just be vigilant and share that with your team. As Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler suggested, try and have open dialogue with your student and maybe with their friends. That's also a good way to get extra insight, depending upon the rapport and relationship you have and their ability to communicate. Some of the students we're talking about are nonverbal. They might not have language to communicate. So as parents, it's not just what they say, but how they say it and how they communicate it holistically with all of their body. Pay attention to those pieces would be my advice. And then don't wait, but already 3 weeks into the school year, if you have a concern, please raise it and address it so it doesn't manifest and become something much bigger that you and the team have to tackle in a few weeks' time.
That sounds so great, Jane. I want to follow up on something that you said, Lawrence, before. You were talking about the homework that students bring home, but it's really classwork and that parents shouldn't be doing it. This relates very much to what you were talking about, Jane, and what you were talking about before, Lawrence. And I would love to get your take on this because I see it all the time. What happens is the parents are dismayed that the kids are not doing their work, or they're not doing their work unless the parents sit down with them, or they're not doing the work unless the parents sit down with them and do it with them, do it for them. Where do you draw the line, right? And then they get to a point where the parents are like, okay, this is untenable. And so they go to the school and the school says, but wait, this students have been doing their homework and look at their grades. They're getting A's and B's. And the parent says, but no, they wouldn't be getting A's and B's unless I would, if I weren't doing the homework for them. And the schools are like, well, what should we do? So because you haven't let the school see what the students really are capable of doing, right? And I wonder if you could speak to that in terms of gathering the data that Jane's talking about when you go to the school.
Well, the simple solution that I've suggested to many of my clients, you sit down and write the starting time for home. If homework is for 1 hour, we sat down at 7:01, took a 10-minute break, and finished at 8:20. And wherever the homework is by 8:20, that's it. I had a client many years ago that did exactly what you were talking about. She was up to 11 o'clock at night doing her son's homework. And I said to her somewhat facetiously, I said, what is it? You don't understand 5th grade math? And she said, well, I'm a college graduate. And then the light bulb said, you're right. Why am I up to 11 o'clock at night doing my son's homework? If it's an hour, we end at 60 minutes or 60, 70 minutes with a 10-minute break. And wherever it is, that's it. Because otherwise parents are masking their child's difficulty. If they learn a concept in school, then homework is supposed to reinforce the concept that the child has learned. If they haven't learned the concept in school, unless the parents are the teachers, they know the curriculum, whatever, then parents are put at a distinct disadvantage, and it's unfair to the child, It's unfair to the parent-child relationship, and it's unfair to the parents to be put in that position. And that's why the simple solution is, if it's 1 hour, this is the start time, this is when we end it. TV was off, the phone was in the closet, whatever. We sat down, and wherever homework is done, the dining room table, the family, wherever homework is done, that's it. And parents should not be the arbiter or the referee, and they certainly shouldn't be jumping in the ring to get their child to do homework. It is, if the child learns something, they should be excited to show the parent, how they solve the math equation.
And this is number 3 of what Dr. Cohen said is one of the top 3 strategies. Only give as much help as they really need. I think this is a really good example of that, strategy.
Yeah, you're really doing them a disservice. Probably about 10 years ago, 20 years ago, who knows? I saw a girl who was going to college, and her mom was a little worried because she didn't think that she had the skills to go to college. And when I tested her, I was extremely shocked to learn that she really had some grave weaknesses that her mother was right to be concerned about. And I thought, how is she getting these good grades in school? So she was 17, by the way. And so I asked her, how are you getting such good grades in school? And she said, oh, well, my grandmother comes over and does science and math for me, and my mother does English and social studies. And that's, and the poor girl, she just was not ready to graduate from high school. There was so much, she had to know. So I agree with you, Lawrence. It's really doing kids a disservice. It's just covering up problems, and it's leaving them without resources. And what we really want for our kids, not just for their mental health, but for everything, we want them to be resourceful, and we want them to be resilient. And so identifying problems early and figuring out strategies of how to help them to learn skills and help them to overcome obstacles and cope, that's what our kids need, no matter what they do.
Well, I have a last question for Lawrence that came in before tonight, and it was, if a teen has a 504 plan, then whether or not the teachers follow up on it is to their discretion. So even if you have a plan, you have the IEP, you have the 504, Lawrence, what can a parent do to help the teen go along and work with the team to implement that plan if it's a 504, for example?
Well, you have to look at the 504 plan language. Does it apply to a specific class? Does it apply to all classes? And if it applies to all classes, then teachers don't have discretion. The 504 plan, like an IEP, has to be followed as written. So if you have, for example, alternate test setting or extra time, or other types of accommodation, it's not up to the teacher to decide whether or not you get that accommodation, unless that's what's in the plan. Every so often, I'll see an IEP or a 504 plan, so you get the accommodation as needed. Well, if that's in there, the teacher has discretion. But if it applies to all classes, then the teacher has no discretion. So it's very important that the language of the IEP, which also has accommodations, and the language of the 504 plan, which is solely about accommodations, is clear, unambiguous, and understandable. And if it's not, go back to another 504 or PPT meeting in Connecticut and clarify the ambiguity in the plan. We are getting close to our appointed hour. I know we have many questions we haven't gotten to, but I do want to give 2 housekeeping notes. All of our contact information is in the chat. And for those who arrived late, this webinar is being recorded. If you registered, you'll be getting a copy of tonight's webinar, and I believe it's on YouTube also. Is that so? As well. Yes. Okay. And to my immediate right is my producer, also my daughter, who I also want to thank for doing all the technical work and getting the announcements out and arranging all that is behind the scene that make these webinars happen. So I want to thank everybody who's stayed with us throughout the evening for your support and response to our webinar. We will be having another webinar. I believe it's on October 18th. It'll be a roundtable discussion with Jane, Ali Grafman, an advocate, and Carol Frankenberger, who's the executive director of Frankenberger and Associates. And we'll be meeting on October 18th at 7 p.m. Jane, you already know, she's the director of JumpStart and a special education advocate. Carol is also a psychoeducational diagnostician. So we'll be getting into some topics with your questions in advance of October 18th. If you found tonight's webinar informative, please do not hesitate to register in the future in the chat area before you sign off. Jane and I will keep a watchful eye on special education issues. There are legislation down in Washington. Our Senator Chris Murphy is trying to push the Keep Students Safe Act, CASA, which will outlaw seclusion and restraint. Please contact Senator Murphy's office and show your support if that's a topic of interest. We will have other updates as the year evolves. I want to thank Dr. Cohen-Sandler for her collaborative effort, her insightful thoughts and comments, and we look forward to having her join us again sometime in the near future. And as I said, I do want to thank my daughter Rachel, who makes this happen with all the behind the scenes work that she does. Jane, I don't have anything else. Jane, and then Ronnie, Dr. Ronnie, you want to have some concluding remark? Oh, I forgot one other housekeeping. On my website, I think it's in the chat, we do have a back to school handout, 10 strategies for transitioning back to school for parents to refer to, so you can help continue to take ownership in your child's education. Some of what we had discussed tonight is in the top 10 strategies, particularly having open lines of communication between the family and the school back to the family. If you don't have this available in the chat, it is available on my website, BerlinerSpecialEducationLaw.com, and all of that should be in the contact information.
Thank you, Lawrence, and thank you, Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler. It's been a wonderful conversation tonight, and I think it's one that we should continue later in this year. Unfortunately, this isn't a situation that is going to be disappearing anytime soon, with the lack of resources available within districts, and obviously the increasing problems facing our students and their families. I also wanted to make everybody aware that we have a special education resource fair happening at the Stamford JCC on October the 1st. We actually have 46 vendors coming, so that will be special education attorneys, advocates, also some representatives from different special education schools, therapeutic resources, practitioners, a whole host of different related practitioners related to the field of special education for all ages. So for those that are younger through to those that are young adults or transitioning. So please come and join us at the Stamford JCC on October the 1st between 2 and 5 o'clock. I look forward to meeting some of you in person if you do come along. And we're co-hosting that event with a special education legal fund. So hopefully to see you all then, and look forward to our next conversation. And thank you, Rachel, Lawrence's daughter, who makes this happen, and also his lovely wife, Debbie, who also helps to liaise and make these webinars a reality. So thank you to you both. And Roni Cohen-Sandler, thank you so much for sharing your expertise tonight. It's invaluable advice, and I hope that families are able to watch and re-listen to this and follow some of your guidance and pick up some of your books and take the time to read them, because it's an extensive studies that you have and lots of delightful information to share.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoy these discussions with you too, and I always learn things. And I think Rachel has included some contact information for me as well. So if any families have any questions that they want to follow up, because I know it was such a limited amount of time and many questions, don't hesitate to contact me. I'm happy to help. Thank you again for having me.
And we will continue this next month. Stay safe and healthy, and we'll see everybody next month on October 18th. And thank you.